Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. Please remember to subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Nonton Satu Pukulan Demi Keadilan, Suli Suara. The film unfolds in a gritty landscape where the lines between justice and vengeance are constantly blurred, centering on a man driven by a singular, consuming need for retribution. Our protagonist, let's call him Bhima, is clearly shaped by a past marked by profound loss and a system that failed to deliver the accountability he craved. It's easy to see echoes of classic martial arts cinema in his movements and demeanor. There's a disciplined hardness to him, suggesting a history steeped in rigorous, perhaps even monastic, training. A nod, perhaps, to the Indonesian Silat masters, whose legacies often inform such narratives of righteous fighting. Bhima's journey begins not as a quest for glory, but as a necessary, almost inevitable act. The catalyst is an injustice perpetrated against someone close to him, an event that shatters whatever semblance of peace he had managed to construct. This inciting incident forces him out of the shadows and onto a collision course with a well-entrenched criminal element, one clearly protected by layers of corruption. The antagonists are formidable, often operating under the guise of legitimate business, which speaks volumes about the pervasive nature of their influence. One key figure in this network, perhaps a former business associate or rival of Bhima's past life, exhibits a chilling blend of corporate polish and brutal efficiency. It's the kind of character arc we often see in films where ambition has completely eclipsed morality, a cautionary tale about success achieved through immoral means, perhaps drawing inspiration from real-world narratives of powerful figures operating outside the law. As Bhima systematically dismantles the network, the action sequences are anything but gratuitous. They serve as narrative punctuation, each fight scene revealing more about his psychological state. The fighting style is visceral, grounded, avoiding unnecessary theatrics in favor of brutally effective strikes, reinforcing the idea that for Bhima, this is not sport. It's surgery. He moves with the calculated precision of someone who understands anatomy intimately, perhaps hinting at a background that involved more than just fighting, maybe security work or specialized law enforcement before he went rogue. Throughout his pursuit, moments of quiet reflection break the tension, offering glimpses into the man behind the relentless executioner. We understand that this path of violence is costly, isolating him further. This emotional undercurrent elevates the story beyond a simple revenge flick. It becomes a meditation on the price of administering one's own justice when the official channels are shown to be compromised. His resolve isn't fueled by anger alone, but by a deep-seated commitment to a moral code that the rest of society has abandoned. The final confrontation is inevitable, a deeply personal reckoning where Bhima finally corners the architect of his suffering. This climax isn't about a spectacular display of power, but rather the closure of a painful chapter. Even in victory, there's a palpable sense of exhaustion, suggesting that while justice, however defined, has been served, the cost to the deliverer is irreversible. The film concludes not with triumph, but with a somber acknowledgement that the road to peace, paved with violent necessity, leaves permanent scars. Bhima disappears back into the anonymity he once inhabited, a ghost having settled his accounts. The protagonist, Bhima, carries the weight of his history not just in his hardened gaze, but in the very economy of his movements. It's clear that his time away from the spotlight, whether spent in military service, perhaps specialized intelligence operations, where moral ambiguity is a daily companion, or deep immersion in traditional martial arts disciplines far from urban sprawl, was a crucible. This past isn't merely backstory, it dictates his present. When he enters a room, he's not looking for trouble, but rather calculating the exit points and threat vectors, a habit ingrained by necessity. His silence isn't stoicism, it's the discipline of someone who has learned that words are liabilities when survival and mission are paramount. The antagonist, let's label him Sang Raja, the kingpin, embodies the seductive rot of unchecked capitalist power fused with local strong-arm tactics. If Bhima represents the unbending steel of principle, Sang Raja is the polished brass of expediency. We sense that Sang Raja might have once admired the discipline Bhima possessed, perhaps viewing him as a wasted resource, or maybe they were on opposite sides of a very significant forgotten deal years prior. A conflict rooted in ambition, territory, or a shared, flawed mentor figure. Sang Raja's empire isn't built just on brute force. It relies on whispers in high places, leveraging financial ruin and bureaucratic entanglement to neutralize threats before they ever manifest physically. His office, all glass and imported mahogany, serves as a direct visual contrast to the shadowed alleyways where Bhima does his necessary work, highlighting the chasm between institutional corruption and street-level reckoning. The emotional texture of the film is often carried in the peripheral moments. We see Bhima occasionally pause near flickering neon signs or the periphery of family gatherings he can no longer partake in. These fleeting instances reveal the human being submerged beneath the avenging machine, a man starved of connection. His interactions with any supporting characters, perhaps an old contact from his previous life or a concerned, weary detective, are brief and transactional, emphasizing his self-imposed isolation. He accepts help grudgingly, viewing it as creating a new vulnerability he cannot afford. The fight choreography itself feels personal. When Bhima engages the Kingpin's enforcers, it's less about dazzling aerial kicks and more about efficient disabling. There's a noticeable emphasis on leverage, joint manipulation, and utilizing the environment, techniques favored by practitioners who prioritize ending the conflict immediately rather than proving superiority. This efficiency speaks to a career where the stakes were always life or death, where wasting energy meant failing the objective. His dedication to this singular act of justice is so complete that it borders on a spiritual endeavor, albeit a dark one. He is executing a contract he made with his own conscience, and the target is the termination of this ongoing pain. The atmosphere surrounding Bhima is perpetually heavy, steeped in the understanding that every punch thrown buys him a little more time but pushes him further from any potential redemption or normal life. The film suggests that for some wrongs, the only true equilibrium is achieved through this kind of absolute, self-sacrificing confrontation. The narrative gains depth through the introduction of minor figures who orbit Bhima's dark orbit, often serving as painful reminders of the world he abandoned. There is the ghost of a former colleague, perhaps a mentor figure named Pak Tua, whose fate, perhaps death or deep disillusionment, directly fuels Bhima's initial impetus. Pak Tua might have been a man who tried to work within the flawed system, only to be betrayed or broken by the very corruption Bhima now seeks to eradicate. This personal history lends a tragic dimension to Bhima's crusade. He is not just punishing an act, but avenging a failed ideal represented by this older man. Sang Raja's network also features a key lieutenant, perhaps a man whose background mirrors Bhima's in some twisted way. Maybe a former soldier or police officer who chose the lucrative path of criminality over thankless duty. Let's call him Ryan. Ryan is the mirror image, demonstrating what Bhima could have become had he succumbed to cynicism instead of channeling his formidable skills toward a personal moral imperative. Their eventual clashes are less about Bhima defeating a lesser foe and more about Bhima confronting a possible future self, making these encounters emotionally charged confrontations over ideology as much as physical prowess. Ryan fights with a certain wild, almost joyful abandon that Bhima conspicuously lacks. Ryan enjoys the power, while Bhima merely endures the necessity of wielding it. The environment itself becomes a character, a sprawling, indifferent city that seems to swallow secrets whole. When Bhima tracks targets through crowded night markets or derelict industrial zones, the sensory details are sharp. The smell of diesel and fried food, the oppressive humidity, the cacophony of urban life that continues unabated despite the violence unfolding in its shadows. These settings underscore the theme that the rot of corruption is systemic, affecting the very fabric of daily life, ignored by the masses too busy surviving. Bhima's internal landscape is rarely articulated through dialogue, but through action and reaction. A subtle tremor in his hand as he cleans a weapon, a prolonged, unblinking stare when receiving critical information. These minute details convey a soul under tremendous pressure. The audience understands that his relentless pursuit is a form of self-medication. Stopping would mean facing the unresolved grief and guilt he carries. The single punch referenced in the film's implied title is not just an event, but a philosophical statement. In a world where due process is a farce, a singular, undeniable act of force can sometimes reestablish a momentary, brutal balance. The film suggests that this violent justice is ultimately unsustainable, a fever that must break, leaving the feverish individual depleted. The final moments, therefore, aren't about celebration, but the quiet, grim task of surviving the aftermath of personal war. The weight Bhima carries manifests profoundly in his physical toll. By the midway point of his mission, he is no longer the pristine warrior implied by his initial efficient movements. His clothing is perpetually frayed, a bruise coloring his jawline seems permanent, and the quickness of his step is occasionally betrayed by a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a souvenir from an early skirmish that he refuses to address medically, seeing pain as an unwelcome but necessary companion. This physical degradation mirrors the erosion of his own humanity. Each righteous act demands a piece of his former self as payment. Sangraja, increasingly aware of the spectral threat Bhima poses, begins to show cracks in his own polished veneer. His meticulously controlled environment starts to fray. We see glimpses of his paranoia. Security protocols become tighter, more redundant, bordering on the frantic. His composure, usually maintained through the sheer force of habit and inherited status, falters during tense phone calls where Bhima's name is mentioned. Sangraja's inspiration is perhaps rooted in the classic archetype of the fallen titan, someone who once believed they were building a necessary structure, only to realize they built a gilded cage for themselves. His power is transactional. He's surrounded by loyalty, bought with fear and money, contrasting sharply with the ideological, albeit violent, bond Bhima forges with his own grim purpose. The few allies Bhima interacts with carry their own burdens of disillusionment. Consider the character of Sari, perhaps a former journalist or archivist. Bhima seeks out for information on Sangraja's historical financial maneuvers. Sari operates from a hidden digital space, her face illuminated solely by monitor light. She embodies the intellectual resistance to the corruption, the kind of person who understands that truth must be unearthed with patience, a pace Bhima can ill afford. Her fear isn't of Sangraja directly, but of the futility of exposing evil in a society that prefers comfort over confrontation. She provides Bhima the map, but he is the explosive charge. Their exchanges are curt, built on mutual respect for sacrifice, but underscored by Sari's quiet pleading for Bhima to find a way out that doesn't end in bloodshed. The aesthetic of the action shifts as Bhima closes in. The earlier fights were about demolition. The later ones become about infiltration and psychological warfare. When Bhima finally engages Ryan, the lieutenant, the setting is often claustrophobic, perhaps an abandoned warehouse or the labyrinthine service tunnels beneath one of Sangraja's legitimate fronts. This fight isn't about technique, it's about endurance and conviction. Rian fights with the desperate energy of a man trying to prove his chosen, corrupt path was the correct one, shouting taunts that question Bhima's ascetic suffering. Bhima responds only with perfectly placed deflections and counters, absorbing Ryan's wild swings until the lieutenant exhausts his own misplaced zeal. The victory over Ryan is tragic because it confirms that Bhima has not only succeeded in his vengeance, but has also eliminated a path of alternative survival for himself. The single punch, the ultimate expression of his philosophy, is thus delivered not just to the villain, but to the possibility of a shared future for men with such skills. The silence after the final confrontation is deafening, filled only with the echoes of what was lost in the earning of that temporary, brutal justice. The denouement leaves Bhima adrift in the sudden, unnatural quiet following the execution of his purpose. The city, which moments before seemed to pulse with the energy of his hunt, now feels oppressive in its indifference. He doesn't seek accolades or even confirmation of Sangraja's demise from any official source. His justice is entirely self-contained and recognized only by the cessation of his own internal torment. This immediate aftermath is perhaps the most dangerous period for a man conditioned entirely for conflict. Without an external enemy to focus his immense reservoir of skill and adrenaline, the focus inevitably turns inward, probing the wounds that revenge failed to fully cauterize. We see Bhima performing the simple, mundane rituals of survival in a cheap, transient lodging, perhaps cleaning his few possessions, the act rendered almost ceremonial. These actions are performed with the same meticulous attention he paid to setting up the final ambush, suggesting that for him, the maintenance of the self is now the only remaining mission. There is a palpable sense of emotional nudity. The driving necessity that shaped his every waking moment has vanished, leaving a void that is terrifyingly unfamiliar. Any fleeting memory of the person he was before the initial tragedy, perhaps a picture tucked away, faded and ignored, offers no comfort, only a sharp reminder of the distance he has traveled into the shadows. The film carefully avoids any simplistic suggestion that peace has been found. Instead, the pervasive emotion is one of profound exhaustion, bordering on spiritual bankruptcy. He walks through crowded streets not as an invisible hunter, but as an alien presence, observing ordinary life, a child laughing, a couple arguing over groceries, with a detachment that borders on incomprehension. These moments underscore the theme that while Bhima achieved his singular goal, the price was the severance of his connection to the shared human experience. His victory is an absolute solitude. The narrative concludes not with a final confrontation, but with an ambiguous departure. Bhima sheds the last vestiges of his operational identity, discarding the specialized gear, perhaps even altering his distinctive physical presentation slightly, though the hardened lines of his face remain indelible. Whether he seeks true anonymity in another distant city or simply walks into the anonymous wilderness, the intention is the same: to become unreadable again. His story doesn't resolve into a happy ending or a tragic downfall, but rather into a continuation of his existence as a necessary, almost mythological figure whose purpose has been fulfilled, leaving behind only the quiet implication that the systemic failures he fought against remain untouched, waiting for the next catalyst to summon another lonely executioner. He steps out of the frame, a necessary shadow fading back into the backdrop of the flawed world he momentarily tried to mend with violence. The final act of Bhima's vanishing is characterized by a deliberate erasure of presence, a professional's final, necessary withdrawal. It's not a frantic escape, but a slow, methodical shedding of connection, mirroring the way a snake molts its skin to become something new, albeit, in Bhima's case, something emptier. He visits Sari one last time, not for information, but perhaps for a final, wordless acknowledgement of their shared proximity to danger. Sari, recognizing the finality in his posture, the lack of tension that characterized his earlier movements, replaced now by a slackness of soul, offers him a small, non-monetary token, maybe a key to a remote, forgotten safe house, a gesture of desperate human goodwill that Bhima accepts with a curt nod, unable or unwilling to articulate thanks. This interaction is crucial. It shows that even in his isolation, he understands the currency of human connection, even if he can no longer spend it. The decision to leave is informed by the lingering threat that his existence poses, not just to himself, but to anyone who might still be attached to his memory. He ensures that no loose ends, no traceable contacts, no known routines remain that Sangh Raja's surviving apparatus, however crippled, could exploit. This cleanliness is almost obsessive, suggesting that his discipline, honed in the crucible of his training, remains the primary organizing principle of his life, even in dissolution. He might leave behind one item that signifies his past life before the tragedy, perhaps a very old, non-functional watch, placing it deliberately on a bare table, a silent marker that the time for that life has definitively ended. As he moves through the transit points, a dusty bus station, a ferry terminal where the air is thick with brine and distant promise, his focus is entirely on blending, on achieving the ultimate invisibility. He doesn't look back at the city skyline that he carved a scar into. He looks only at the next necessary step. There is a moment where he passes a young man engaged in some street performance, a quick display of martial arts prowess perhaps, vibrant and full of youthful arrogance. Bhima pauses for a beat, a faint, almost painful flicker of recognition crossing his face. It's the ghost of his own former energy, untainted by the necessity of vengeance. This is not envy, but a sorrowful recognition of innocence lost. The film refuses the catharsis of a clear resolution because Bhima's struggle was never about fixing the world. It was about settling a personal debt that, once paid, left him bankrupt in every other sense. The final scene might find him on a remote coastal road, perhaps hitchhiking or walking towards the horizon line where the gray sea meets the gray sky. The visual language suggests a merging with the environment, becoming as unremarkable and enduring as the landscape itself. The singular blow that marked his journey has been struck, but the echo of that violence reverberates in his solitude. He has achieved justice, yes, but the cost was the very self that sought it. He disappears not into freedom, but into a necessary continuation of penance, a life sentence served in anonymity. The true ending of Bhima's journey hinges on the silence that follows his departure, a silence pregnant with the unspoken understanding that the external battle has ended, but the internal siege continues indefinitely. His adoption of anonymity is not a flight from justice, but a self-imposed exile, a recognition that the skills which made him an effective instrument of vengeance are fundamentally incompatible with the quiet texture of ordinary existence. He doesn't transition into retirement, he transitions into maintenance mode, perpetually guarding the fragile peace he bought with extreme violence. If one were to speculate on his immediate future, it would involve an almost complete denial of his past capabilities, forcing himself into low-impact, low-consequence environments. Perhaps he takes work that demands physical labor but zero strategic engagement, tending a remote farm, working in a dockyard far from the urban corruption he dismantled. The irony here is poignant. A man capable of taking down an organized criminal syndicate must now expend enormous energy, simply ensuring his coffee is brewed without any trace of excess flair or lethal efficiency. The emotional landscape now features a constant, low-grade battle against memory. When a sudden, loud noise occurs, a backfiring vehicle, a dropped metal object, Bhima's body tenses involuntarily, the muscle memory of threat assessment kicking in before his conscious mind can suppress it. These micro-reactions are his constant tormentors, proof that the war zone resides permanently within his nervous system. The inspiration drawn from figures who become hardened by the machinery of violence, the disillusioned intelligence operative or the monastic warrior, is fully realized here. The machine is permanently engaged even when the target is gone. Furthermore, the film implies a subtle continuity in the larger narrative of the city's decay. Bhima eliminated one cancer, Sang Raja, but the systemic corruption he fought against is an ecosystem, not an individual. Sari, the archivist, might represent the flicker of hope for conventional change, but her cautious methods stand in stark contrast to Bhima's scorched earth policy. Her continued work, though now under greater personal risk without Bhima as a temporary shield, suggests that another form of reckoning might be brewing, one fought with evidence rather than fists. Bhima's act, therefore, becomes less of a definitive victory and more of a necessary, violent intermission, clearing the stage for others to attempt a more sustainable form of justice. His final image is perhaps not walking toward the horizon, but simply ceasing to be visible. He might occupy a space, a small room, a sparsely populated roadside diner, for days, observing without interacting until the locals simply stop noticing him, perceiving him as part of the furniture, a shadow that belongs there. This ultimate success, becoming entirely unremarkable, is the only peace afforded to the man who chose to wield a single, perfect strike for the sake of justice. He is not saved. He is simply shelved, waiting for the next inevitable collapse of order that might, perhaps, call upon his terrible expertise once more. The theme of necessary violence begets a recursive cycle, is powerfully underlined by the subtle hints of a vacuum created by Sang Raja's removal. While Bhima focused on the architect of the injustice, the sprawling network he commanded hasn't simply dissolved, it has entered a phase of dangerous fragmentation. Minor players, previously held in check by the kingpin's iron grip, are now scrambling for dominance, leading to localized outbursts of chaos that Bhima, in his self-imposed retirement, actively avoids witnessing. This averted gaze is telling. His contract was personal retribution, not civic duty, and he refuses to be drawn back into the mire by the collateral damage of his own success. To engage again would be to invalidate the absolute finality he sought in his initial rampage. This avoidance forces Bhima into increasingly isolated circumstances where anonymity is guaranteed, yet so is stagnation. Imagine him taking lodgings in a place where the local dialect is unfamiliar, a deliberate choice to handicap his ability to effortlessly integrate or gather information. His greatest fear is no longer capture or confrontation, but recognition. The idea that someone, somewhere, might trace the precise, devastating ripple effect back to the source of the shockwave. He begins to rely on routines so monotonous they become invisible to casual observation, always buying the same cheap bread, always walking the same unremarkable route to a distant water source. This routine is the new discipline, a shield against the specter of his former self. The emotional resonance peaks when Bhima is confronted not by a remaining enforcer, but by an echo of his own past idealism. Perhaps he encounters a young, zealous individual, maybe a student radical or a budding activist, who is attempting to honor Bhima's anonymous, violent act by trying to replicate its symbolic weight in smaller, less effective ways. This young person sees Bhima as a legend, a mythic figure of retribution, perhaps even approaching him for guidance on how to fight the system. For Bhima, this encounter is agonizing. He sees the naive hunger for justice he himself once possessed, now contaminated by the grim realities he's experienced. His response is not mentorship, but a harsh, cold discouragement, a desperate attempt to inoculate this younger generation against the allure of violent finality, perhaps muttering something about the singular nature of his own necessity that cannot be taught or repeated. He understands intimately that what he did was a terminus, not a blueprint. Ultimately, the film suggests that Bhima's legacy is not the systemic change he failed to achieve, but the profound, terrifying lesson he learned that enacting justice outside the established framework demands the complete forfeiture of one's place within the framework. His singular blow was effective against one man, but insufficient against the culture that bred him. The film closes not on a note of hope or despair, but on a chilling sense of equilibrium achieved through self-annihilation of spirit. Bhima fades not into the sunset, but into the vast, indifferent gray of the everyday, a perfectly executed erasure, leaving behind only the unsettling question of whether true justice can ever be truly clean. The finality of Bhima's self-imposed disappearance is underscored by a conscious effort to shed any material connection to the life that preceded his vendetta. He doesn't simply leave a location, he strips away layers of identity. His few possessions, utilitarian, chosen for their lack of traceable origin, are either discarded or deliberately mixed with the refuse of whatever temporary dwelling he occupied. The meticulous nature of this unburdening reflects the same focused intensity he brought to tracking Seng Raja. But now the objective is negative, to create zero footprint. This careful decreation of self is perhaps the most exhausting labor he has undertaken, far more draining than the physical battles. His interactions, even the brief ones with Sari, serve only to reinforce his alienation. If Sari represents the persistent, though cautious pursuit of institutional truth, Bhima represents the necessary, albeit destructive application of raw, unfiltered consequence. The slight acknowledgement he offers Sari upon their last meeting is not warmth, but a recognition of shared pathology. They both inhabit spaces where the official narrative is known to be a lie. just through different means. Sari fears the system's long memory. Bhima fears the system's continued existence without him to disrupt it. The subtle limp Bhima developed is now masked, not through healing, but through conscious gait adjustment, a constant tiny performance for an audience of 0. This constant self-monitoring reveals the true duration of his sentence. It is not over when the target dies, but when the body can finally stop being prepared for the next fight. And that moment, the film suggests, may never arrive. He might attempt an act of creation, perhaps tending a small garden patch in a borrowed, forgotten space, only to find his hands instinctively clenching, ready to strike the earth or crush a perceived threat, unable to trust in gentle cultivation. The narrative subtly frames Bhima as a tragic figure inspired by ancient archetypes, the hero who must destroy the monster, but in doing so, takes on the monster's necessary brutality. His physical prowess, honed over years, is now merely a cumbersome excess weight, a set of specialized tools he can never safely put down. When he encounters the vibrant, perhaps reckless youth practicing martial arts, the sorrow in Bhima's eyes isn't just about lost innocence. It's the profound realization that he has become a cautionary tale in motion. He embodies the dead end of vengeance as a solution. The ultimate message is bleak yet resonant within the context of raw justice cinema. Sometimes the system is so entirely corrupted that the only path to equilibrium involves a self-immolating act of personal reckoning. Bhima secures his justice, but sacrifices his future, becoming a phantom whose existence serves only as a haunting footnote to the larger ongoing failure of civil order. His disappearance is the only honest conclusion to a life lived entirely outside the bounds of societal rules. He simply reverts to the shadows from which he was temporarily, violently summoned. The echoes of Bhima's actions resonate most strongly in the way the world refuses to acknowledge his passage. As he deliberately submerges himself into the anonymity of peripheral existence, the film focuses on the sheer lack of impact his survival is supposed to have. He seeks out places where time moves slowly and where individual histories are irrelevant, perhaps a remote coastal fishing community or a high-altitude village where life is dictated by weather rather than wealth. In these settings, his intense, coiled energy begins to manifest not as aggression, but as profound stillness, a sort of exhausted meditation. He is trying to unlearn the language of a threat assessment. His former discipline, so lethal when directed outward, now becomes a strange form of penance when applied to simplicity. If he decides to take on manual labor, say helping mend nets or repair stone walls, his movements are over-precise. He will tie a knot with a structural integrity that suggests it should be holding up a bridge, not a fishing vessel, only to watch the local workers unravel it slightly, because that's how it's always been done. This friction between his perfected necessity and the flawed, resilient rhythm of ordinary life highlights the gap between his world of absolute consequence and the world of accepted compromise. The ghost of Sangraja also persists, not through active enemies, but through the structural permanence of the corruption. Bhima sees newspaper headlines, often weeks or months old in these remote locations, detailing the corporate restructuring of Sangraja's assets, the installation of a slightly cleaner, equally ruthless successor. This observation confirms Bhima's deepest fear, that his singular focused demolition only cleared the ground for the next growth cycle of rot. This realization prevents any sense of triumph. There is only the heavy burden of knowing the fight was localized, not systemic. The rare moments Bhima allows himself to reflect are tied to small sensory details: the taste of clean, unpolluted water, or the sound of undisturbed nature. These moments suggest the original Bhima, the man whose moral code was intact before the central tragedy, was someone deeply appreciative of simplicity and order. His inspiration for fighting, therefore, wasn't purely hatred. It was the desire to restore a world where such simple beauties weren't constantly threatened by predatory greed. This restoration failed, leaving him stranded in a world he momentarily cleansed, but could not keep clean. His final, definitive disappearance is visualized not as a journey to a destination, but as a deliberate fading of contrast. He stops projecting any discernible identity. He might sit in the shade of a massive, ancient tree, watching the sun set over the indifferent ocean. There is no final monologue, no letter left for sorry. His story concludes with the absolute success of his chosen path. He becomes functionally invisible. He has achieved the ultimate objective of the disciplined warrior when all wars are over: to become functionally inert without being physically dead. He simply ceases to register as a character in the narrative, an enduring testament to the fact that sometimes the only way to win a war against overwhelming corruption is to remove oneself entirely from the playing field, leaving behind only the silence where a terrible, necessary violence once reigned. The true finality of Bhima's self-erasure is marked by a strange kind of peace that is utterly devoid of hope. He has achieved the philosophical goal of the lone avenger: to execute the necessary function and then immediately become irrelevant to the system he corrected. His deliberate immersion into irrelevance is his ultimate act of discipline, a final, silent refusal to become the next charismatic leader, the next figurehead for discontent, roles he inherently rejects because they demand visibility and sustained engagement. If he were to encounter Sari again, the exchange would be purely observational. She might see him from a distance, perhaps noticing the familiar tension in his shoulders, even as he attempts to appear relaxed while performing some mundane task. She would understand that his stillness is not rest, but the holding pattern of a primed explosive device that has intentionally diffused itself. Any attempt on her part to communicate, to share news of minor victories against the continuing corruption, would be met with Bhima's absolute blankness, a protective mechanism ensuring no new emotional anchor can tether him to the world he judged and found wanting. His physical existence becomes minimalist to the extreme. Food is fuel, shelter is only protection from the elements, and human contact is avoided at all costs. This asceticism is a direct evolution from his previous life. Where he once trained his body to endure pain for a mission, he now trains it to endure emptiness for survival. He is haunted by the knowledge that the one punch that settled his debt was merely a tactical victory, not a strategic one. The inspiration drawn from Stoic figures in martial history, those who embraced suffering for an abstract ideal, is twisted here. Bhima suffers not for an ideal, but because the price of achieving his single ideal was the complete demolition of his capacity for joy. The film ends not with a bang, nor a whimper, but with a slow fade to white, or perhaps just an unchanging frame of empty landscape where Bhima was last sighted. The camera lingers on the spot where he was, emphasizing the void he leaves behind. His story functions as a closed circuit. The system failed him. He created his own justice outside the system, and by doing so, he exiled himself from the very society he sought to purify for the sake of his lost loved one. His legacy is the testament that when structures of justice are broken, The repair job often requires an agent so perfectly calibrated for destruction that they cannot survive in the resulting imperfect piece. Bhima becomes less a man and more a necessary cautionary tale, a shadow figure who proved that while vengeance can be perfectly executed, it never truly redeems the executor. The final tableau eschews any lingering shot of Bhima moving onward. Instead, the camera settles on a single, immutable detail within the isolated environment he has chosen. Perhaps the perfectly smooth, almost polished stone he habitually rests his hand upon while sitting, or a section of wall he has repaired with unnatural, geometric precision. This inanimate object becomes the repository for all the unresolved tension of his character. It is solid, unyielding, and utterly silent, reflecting the state Bhima desperately seeks for his own turbulent interior. The prevailing emotion in the film's final moments is a profound, echoing melancholy. The understanding that the cost of absolute moral clarity in a morally compromised world is absolute isolation. Bhima's victory over Sangraja was never about liberation for the masses. It was about achieving a private, agonizing equilibrium with his own conscience. Now that the ledger is balanced, the weight of existence without the singular purpose of vengeance is crushing. He is not free. He is simply unburdened by obligation, which leaves him terrifyingly untethered. There is a final, almost subliminal sensory detail that confirms his deep-seated trauma. In the absolute quiet of his remote location, Bhima might react to the sound of a distant siren, perhaps one he associates with the city or one that mirrors a sound from his past trauma. His body doesn't tense violently as before. Instead, his entire frame goes rigid, holding its breath until the sound passes. This is the final evolution of his discipline. Not the readiness to strike, but the desperate internal demand to become unheard and unseen, even by himself. The narrative leaves the audience with the understanding that Bhima is a ghost haunting his own life. His journey confirms the film's dark thesis that true justice, when extracted violently from the roots of institutional decay, requires the self-immolation of the purifier. He could not rejoin the world because the world he fought for, the simple moral structure he mourned the loss of, no longer had a place for the absolute weapon he had become. His disappearance is the ultimate act of self-sacrifice, not for the city, but for the fragile remnants of the moral code he clung to. He is gone, leaving behind the unsettling implication that sometimes the only way to truly defeat the darkness is to become so completely detached from the light that you cease to exist within its perception. The screen fades to black, leaving the viewer suspended in the vast, cold silence Bhima has engineered for himself. The enduring impact of Bhima's narrative lies in its refusal to offer catharsis through conventional closure. His final state, the engineered nullity, becomes a subtle, grim commentary on the futility of singular heroism against systemic rot. If his purpose was to enact justice, his survival proves that such a force cannot coexist with the flawed reality it sought to correct. This paradox is embodied by a subtle, almost imperceptible physical tick that emerges only when Bhima believes himself utterly unobserved, a barely perceptible rocking motion reminiscent of an infant seeking comfort, betraying the sheer exhaustion of a soul that has run out of fuel but cannot stop guarding the empty fuel tank. The landscape he inhabits now is stark, emphasizing the emotional desert he has cultivated. If he is near a body of water, he avoids looking at his own reflection with a profound, almost superstitious dread. The face that stares back is not his own. It is the composite mask forged by Paktua's betrayal, Rian's temptation, and Sangraja's arrogance. To look is to acknowledge the success of the destructive mission, and therefore to reaffirm the necessity of the self he must now erase. Furthermore, Bhima's internalized guilt, once channeled into the righteous fury against Sangraja, now metastasizes into guilt over the consequences of his effectiveness. He is haunted by the memory of the life he abandoned, perhaps replaying a single, mundane memory of his former life. A shared meal, a moment of easy laughter, and realizing that these moments are now inaccessible, locked behind the barricade of his violence. This memory isn't a source of motivation, but a torture device, demonstrating that he traded connection for consequence. The final, lingering philosophical note the film strikes is the distinction between justice and restoration. Bhima achieved the former, a brutal balancing of scales against an individual wrongdoer. But restoration, the healing of the community, the reclaiming of the ideal Paktua died for, remains entirely untouched. His absence is the final, damning piece of evidence. The hero who solves the problem so completely that he can never be part of the solution. Sari, if she were to ever discover his fate, would understand that Bhima didn't escape. He simply completed the transformation from man to necessary myth, a violent punctuation mark in a sentence that continues on, flawed and unresolved. The screen doesn't just fade to black. It dissolves into a texture suggesting dust, decay, and the relentless, indifferent passage of time over the scars he left behind. The narrative arc of Nonton Satu Pukulan Demi Keadilan, particularly in its dubbed version, presents a compelling, if somewhat familiar, exploration of vigilante justice set against a backdrop of systemic failure. The film leans heavily into established tropes of the wronged individual seeking retribution, but its efficacy lies in the nuanced performance of the central figure and the palpable atmosphere of urban decay it establishes. To truly appreciate its impact, one must consider the trajectory of the lead actor, whose past roles often involved playing characters positioned against oppressive forces, lending an authentic weight to his descent into extra-legal action. His previous work in gritty, socially conscious dramas primes the audience to accept his character's motivation, even when the methods employed skirt the edges of morality. The film's pacing is deliberately uneven. The initial segments are devoted to meticulously establishing the protagonist's ordinary life, the small victories and crushing defeats of an everyday citizen, which serves to amplify the shock when the inciting incident occurs. This incident, often involving a betrayal by trusted authority figures or the direct victimization of a loved one, is the necessary catalyst for the transformation. It's here that the influence of classic martial arts cinema, filtered through a modern lens, becomes apparent. Unlike more stylized contemporary action films, the violence here feels clumsy, desperate, and ultimately painful for the perpetrator as much as the victim. This grounding in gritty realism is a conscious choice, distancing it from pure escapism. One interesting aspect of the production is the directorial vision, which seems heavily inspired by late 1970s and early 1980s revenge thrillers, perhaps channeling the raw energy of early John Woo before his more overtly stylized Hong Kong period, or even the grounded paranoia of certain American neo-noirs. The cinematography often utilizes deep shadows and high-contrast lighting, effectively mirroring the protagonist's internal moral shading. Justice, in this universe, is not found in courtrooms, but in dimly lit alleys and abandoned warehouses, environments that naturally become the stage for theatrical confrontations. The supporting cast often plays archetypal roles: the corrupt official, the loyal but cautious friend, and the innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. The effectiveness of these roles hinges on their ability to move beyond caricature. In the better moments of the film, the corrupt official is portrayed not as a cartoon villain, but as a man corrupted by comfort and apathy, making his eventual downfall less about abstract evil and more about a necessary excision from the community fabric. The choice of dubbing, while sometimes an inevitable necessity for wider distribution, introduces a layer of distance that viewers must navigate. In well-executed dubbing, the cadence of the new language attempts to match the emotional intensity of the original performance. However, there are inevitably moments where the synchronization between the visual emotion of the actors and the translated dialogue falters, slightly undermining the raw, visceral quality the director was aiming for in the action sequences. Yet, even with this translational barrier, the core emotional engine, the burning need for recompense, remains universally translatable. Ultimately, Nonton Satu Pukulan Demi Keadilan succeeds not through groundbreaking plot mechanics, but through its commitment to its premise. It asks whether true justice can ever be achieved outside the established order. And while it doesn't offer a comforting answer, it provides a cathartic journey for the protagonist. It serves as a modern parable about the dangerous allure of personal finality, when institutional mechanisms fail to deliver accountability, reflecting a lingering societal unease about power imbalance that continues to resonate strongly with audiences across cultural divides. The emotional core of the protagonist's journey is intrinsically tied to the film's visual language. We are shown repeated vignettes of what he has lost, not in sweeping flashbacks, but through small, tactile details. A child's worn toy, a faded photograph tucked into a wallet, the empty space at a dinner table. These moments, often rendered in soft focus to contrast sharply with the harsh, underexposed scenes of his nightly activities, are crucial in selling the audience on the necessity of his violent trajectory. The actor portraying this central figure often relies on micro-expressions: a tightening of the jaw, a barely perceptible tremor in the hand to convey an internal screaming that the often muffled dialogue struggles to convey fully, especially through the dubbed track. This restraint makes the eventual explosions of violence all the more impactful. They are not moments of glee, but of catastrophic necessity, as if the character is expending the last reserves of his moral energy. Consider the professional background that subtly informs the character's methodology. If the actor previously excelled in portraying figures requiring meticulous planning or intense physical discipline, perhaps a former military operative or a highly skilled craftsman whose former life demanded precision, then the audience subconsciously grants him the competence required for this sudden shift into vigilantism. This assumed competence prevents the character from descending into the realm of the buffoonish avenger. His acts, though brutal, are executed with a chilling efficiency that suggests deep-seated, if misdirected, training. He is not learning how to fight as he goes. He is merely redirecting existing expertise toward a new, darker target set. The film's exploration of morality is further complicated by its handling of secondary antagonists. The main villain, the figure of institutional corruption, is often insulated by layers of bureaucracy and paid loyalists. These loyalists, the hired muscle or the mid-level official doing the dirty work, are perhaps the most tragic figures. They represent those who have chosen comfort or cowardice over integrity. In one particularly memorable sequence, the protagonist confronts a henchman who is clearly terrified, not of death, but of failing to provide for his own family. This interaction forces the audience to confront the notion that the system poisons everyone, creating ripples of necessary cruelty. The protagonist in these moments is not a hero dispensing pure good, but a force of chaotic realignment, leaving behind collateral damage in his wake. The sound design, even accounting for the dubbing inconsistencies, plays a vital role in conveying the emotional stakes. The quiet moments are often punctuated by unsettling ambient city noise. The distant wail of a siren that never arrives to help, the relentless hum of poor ventilation, or the sound of heavy, uneven breathing, suggesting a world perpetually on edge. When violence erupts, the sound mix often prioritizes the blunt impact of flesh and bone over stylized weapon noises, lending a stark, almost documentary feel to the confrontations. This insistence on visceral sound grounds the film when the plot occasionally stretches credulity, anchoring the audience back into the immediate, painful reality of the protagonist's choices. The overall effect is a narrative that, despite its reliance on familiar revenge motifs, manages to feel intensely personal, fueled by a performance that carries the weight of past expectations and the desperate momentum of a man who has nothing left to lose except his increasingly fragile sense of self. The film's commitment to realism extends even to the protagonist's physical deterioration throughout his quest. This is not the clean, athletic choreography often seen in high-budget action spectacles. Rather, we witness a body under duress. Scars accumulate, not just symbolically, but visibly, manifesting as torn clothing, labored breathing, and a visible stiffness in movement that deepens with each confrontation. This visual narrative of decline serves as a counterpoint to the supposed purification sought through vengeance. He is not becoming stronger. He is using up his remaining physical capital, suggesting that the price of this justice is his own systemic collapse. The actor here needs significant stamina, not just for the fight choreography, but for conveying the sustained exhaustion that underpins the character's determination. Furthermore, the film's setting functions almost as a character in its own right. The urban landscape is portrayed as a labyrinthine space where legitimate authority has completely ceded control to shadow economies and entrenched corruption. We see repetitive shots of identical, decaying apartment blocks or brightly lit but sterile government offices that feel inherently hostile. This environmental claustrophobia mirrors the psychological state of the protagonist. He cannot escape the system that wronged him because the system is the environment. His mission isn't just to strike specific targets, it's an attempt to carve out a momentary pocket of breathable air in a toxic ecosystem. The emotional complexity deepens when the film introduces characters tangential to the main conflict who nonetheless become entangled. There is often a maternal figure, perhaps a neighbor or an old acquaintance, who attempts to pull the protagonist back toward normalcy, offering food, shelter, or simply a non-judgmental ear. These brief interludes of potential redemption are crucial because they articulate what the protagonist has sacrificed, the possibility of peace. His rejection of these offers is never arrogant. It is steeped in a tragic resignation, the understanding that once one crosses the line into unforgivable action, there is no functional way back to the life he is fighting to avenge. He has become too contaminated by the required brutality to be welcomed back into the light. The pacing of the final act often shifts from the methodical hunting of the earlier sections to a near feverish rush. This acceleration signals the protagonist a loss of control. He is now less a strategist and more a force reacting to momentum. The final confrontation, often deliberately staged to lack grandeur, perhaps taking place in a mundane location like a deserted parking garage or a poorly lit construction site, emphasizes that this is not a glorious victory, but a messy conclusion to a private tragedy. The final blow is delivered not with righteous fury, but with a hollow exhaustion, leaving the audience with the lingering question, what now? The film intentionally denies the conventional triumph, suggesting that the successful execution of revenge is merely the termination of one destructive path, immediately replaced by the void of purpose. This resonates deeply because it mirrors the audience's own understanding that resolving deep-seated societal injustices requires more than a single, well-placed punch. The ambiguity surrounding the protagonist's fate post-climax is a hallmark of this subgenre, and Satu Pukulan Demi Keadilan handles this ambiguity with notable restraint. Instead of showing a clear arrest or a triumphant escape into the sunset, the narrative often favors lingering on the immediate aftermath of the final violent act. We are left with silence, where the dramatic score should swell, emphasizing the sheer emptiness that follows the expenditure of such intense, focused energy. This is where the film's dedication to a naturalistic, rather than purely heroic, conclusion truly pays off. The audience is denied the easy catharsis of seeing the hero rewarded or punished definitively. Instead, they are presented with a man who has simply run out of road. This narrative choice also forces a critical look at the film's visual language regarding aftermath. If the initial acts utilized high contrast to define the moral divide, the concluding scenes often employ muted, almost washed-out colors, suggesting that the world itself has been drained of vitality by the protagonist's actions. He is often seen alone, possibly tending to grievous wounds in secret. His former world, the domestic bliss he sought to reclaim, now rendered entirely inaccessible. The juxtaposition between the visceral reality of the violence and the utter banality of the recovery process underscores the futility inherent in vigilante justice. There are no dramatic saving graces, only the slow, painful logistics of survival after having broken every societal bond. Moreover, the influence of the lead actor's prior cinematic persona must be re-examined in this context of exhaustion. If the audience has come to expect this actor to embody unwavering moral fortitude, his portrayal here of profound ethical compromise becomes even more unsettling. He is playing against type, not by becoming violent, but by embracing the internal ruin that violence necessitates. His performance suggests an understanding that he has not merely solved a problem, he has become an equal participant in the very decay he sought to eradicate. This subtle betrayal of expectation elevates the material beyond simple exploitation cinema, transforming it into a tragedy of misplaced efficacy. The film subtly weaves in commentary on how information and truth are consumed by the public sphere. Newspaper clippings or brief television news reports might appear fleetingly in the background, reporting on the sudden, violent downfall of corrupt figures. These reports are often sensationalized or incomplete, reflecting a public hunger for dramatic resolution without the messy details of the underlying causes. The protagonist's true motivation and the systematic failures that drove him remain obscured, known only to the audience and perhaps one or two trusted confidants. This reinforces the theme that true systemic justice requires painful, sustained attention, while violence offers only the quick, consumable headline, leaving the root rot untouched. The silence that follows the protagonist's final confrontation is therefore the silence of an unaddressed public discourse, a void where meaningful reform should have been. The characterization of the law enforcement figures who are not overtly corrupt also merits closer examination, as they represent the film's most nuanced critique of institutional limitations. These are the detectives or patrol officers who operate within the prescribed rules, exhibiting competence and a basic sense of duty, yet they are repeatedly shown to be impotent against the forces aligned against the protagonist. Their presence serves to highlight the difference between legal procedure and actual resolution. When they investigate the violence unleashed by the protagonist, their dialogue often reveals a weary cynicism. They understand why the vigilante acts, even as their professional mandate forces them to pursue him. One might see a recurring police character, perhaps a seasoned but nearing retirement detective whose empathy for the victim is palpable, yet whose hands are tied by political maneuvering or jurisdictional boundaries. This detective often finds himself close to understanding the protagonist's actions, perhaps even deliberately overlooking a crucial piece of evidence, creating a silent, temporary alliance built on mutual recognition of a greater injustice. This reluctant acknowledgement of extra-legal necessity deepens the film's texture. It suggests that corruption isn't just about active malevolence, it is equally about the suffocating inertia of bureaucracy that prevents good actors from achieving necessary results. The protagonist, therefore, is not just fighting villains. He is fighting the system's inability to act. When the lead actor, whose persona often embodies stoicism, shares a silent moment of acknowledgement with this detective figure, it's a moment loaded with shared resignation about the broken nature of their shared world. It is a bond forged not in shared ideology, but in shared despair regarding the ineffectiveness of established order. The film's use of urban geography also aids this feeling of systemic paralysis. The protagonist's sanctuary, if he has one, is rarely a place of comfort, but rather a liminal space, an abandoned workshop, a storage unit, or a rooftop overlooking the city sprawl. These spaces are characterized by their detachment from civil society. They are where the rules of the outside world are temporarily suspended. Conversely, the film frequently frames the scenes involving the antagonists within spaces that are outwardly symbols of order or affluence. Sleek corporate offices, exclusive clubs, or well-maintained private residences, but which are rendered visually cold, sterile, and inhuman through sharp, artificial lighting. This visual dichotomy powerfully reinforces the thematic argument. Legitimate society is where the rot hides, while true human struggle and consequence occur in the forgotten, unlit margins. The emotional resonance of the dubbed dialogue, when it fails, sometimes inadvertently creates moments of dark absurdity, which paradoxically can enhance the film's underlying nihilism. A line intended to convey crushing despair might come across as flat or awkwardly phrased, momentarily shattering the dramatic illusion. However, instead of causing the viewer to laugh, this slight disconnect can serve as a reminder that this struggle is perhaps too grand, too ugly, to be perfectly encapsulated by any language or conventional narrative structure. The raw physicality of the actor, the sweat, the blood, and the evident pain become the true universal language, overriding any deficiencies in the translated script, ensuring that the emotional core remains rooted in visceral human experience rather than polished dialogue. The recurring motif of false refuge or sanctuary is skillfully employed to manipulate the audience's sense of hope and subsequent dread. Whenever the protagonist achieves a temporary victory or finds a brief respite, perhaps securing vital evidence or successfully evading immediate pursuit. The film deliberately juxtaposes this small success with a wider shot of the city that dwarfs his efforts. We see him momentarily safe, tending to wounds in a cramped, makeshift space. But the panoramic view from a nearby window reveals the massive, indifferent sprawl of the metropolis, still operating under the dominion of the corrupt forces. This environmental context ensures that the audience never truly settles into a belief that the crisis is averted. The sense of threat is pervasive and structural. This pervasive threat is often embodied by the protagonist's own past associations. There may be a brief, agonizing encounter with an individual from his former legitimate life, perhaps an ex-colleague or an old flame, who represents the life he willingly forfeited. These encounters are crucial because they articulate the cost of his choice in human terms, not just physical ones. The actor must convey a profound, aching regret without breaking his established, hard shell. He looks at this person and sees the future he could have had, a future permanently foreclosed by the single, decisive act of violence. The dialogue in these scenes, especially given the dubbing, relies heavily on what is not said. Long, uncomfortable pauses speak volumes about the gulf that has opened between his moral necessity and societal acceptability. The action choreography itself evolves as the character deteriorates. Early fights might show flashes of defensive skill, aiming for incapacitation. As the film progresses, the choreography becomes purely offensive, almost suicidal. The protagonist seems to be actively inviting blows, using his own body as a tool to absorb damage in exchange for landing the final, decisive strike against a superiorly positioned foe. This descent into near self-annihilation suggests that the end goal is less about justice served and more about personal atonement through exhaustion. His determination is no longer fueled by righteous anger, but by a kind of terminal momentum. He must see the circle close, even if it means his own destruction. Even the minor characters who assist him, often tech-savvy informants or desperate insiders, are rarely portrayed as enthusiastic allies. They are motivated by fear, shared grievance, or a small financial incentive, highlighting the grim reality that in a morally bankrupt system, even altruism is corrupted or transactional. When one of these informants inevitably betrays him or is violently silenced, it further isolates the protagonist, stripping away the last vestiges of easy cooperation. This underscores the central, bleak realization of the film. One cannot clean up a rotten system from the outside without becoming thoroughly soiled in the process. And ultimately, one must face the consequences alone. The narrative skillfully positions the audience not as cheering spectators of a hero, but as silent witnesses to an unavoidable, self-imposed sacrifice. The film employs a distinctive use of lingering shots following the execution of violence, a technique that distances the audience from the immediate, visceral thrill often associated with action cinema. Rather than cutting quickly to the next scene or a moment of triumphant recovery, the camera often remains fixed on the vanquished target or the stunned protagonist amidst the wreckage. This deliberate visual pause compels the viewer to contemplate the aftermath, the stillness, the pooling of blood, the sheer, ugly finality of the act. This stylistic choice directly challenges the voyeuristic tendencies of the genre, forcing a moment of ethical accounting upon the audience who, having invested in the protagonist's quest, must now confront the physical reality of the solution he has chosen. This focus on consequence is often magnified by the way the film portrays the protagonist's physical pain in the ensuing quiet. There is no immediate adrenaline mask. We see the labored breathing, the involuntary flinch from minor movements, and the dawning realization that the body, no matter the purity of the intent, has sustained irreversible damage. The actor's commitment to portraying this functional breakdown is key here. It suggests that every act of retribution carves away a piece of the man seeking it, moving him further from the life he was trying to save for himself or others. It is an internal cost that outweighs the external success. The theme of inherited cycles of violence is subtly introduced through the portrayal of the younger generation, if any are present in the narrative periphery. Perhaps a young relative or a child of a victim watches the protagonist from a distance. These observers are not idolizing him. Their expressions range from profound confusion to outright terror. They represent the future generation who will inherit a world shaped by these brutal choices, suggesting that the vigilante's efforts, while temporarily satisfying a personal vendetta, do little to break the larger cycle of violence that plagues the society. The protagonist's actions become less a cleansing fire and more another spark in an ongoing conflagration. Furthermore, the film frequently utilizes symbolic dream sequences or moments of stark delirium, often induced by injury or exhaustion, to reveal the protagonist's deepest fears. These sequences are usually shot with an unsettling surreality, distorted soundscapes, and fluid camera movements, contrasting sharply with the grounded grit of the main narrative. These glimpses into his subconscious reveal that he fears becoming indistinguishable from the criminals he hunts, suggesting an internal battle where the lines between justice and obsession have completely blurred. This is the final stage of his tragic arc. The realization that the monster he fought has successfully migrated inside him. The film concludes not with a bang or a whimper of defeat, but with a terrifying stillness as the protagonist realizes he has won the battle, but utterly lost the war for his own soul, leaving the audience with a profound sense of tragic inevitability. The psychological toll exacted by the protagonist's relentless pursuit is perhaps the film's most underexamined feature, especially concerning the loss of his own identity. The initial motivation, avenging a specific wrong, becomes progressively subsumed by the sheer need to continue acting. We see glimpses of his former self, the careful planner, the man who valued routine, slowly being eroded by a reactive, purely kinetic existence. This erosion is often symbolized through objects from his past life that he can no longer interact with meaningfully. For instance, a moment where he attempts to use a refined skill from his previous occupation, perhaps meticulously tying a knot or assessing architectural stability, only to botch it due to hand tremors or distraction, underscores how deeply his focus has narrowed to only the mechanics of violence. This failure of competency in his former domain signifies that the price of his new path is the forfeiture of self-definition outside of retribution. The film's soundtrack, beyond the ambient noise, often employs sparse, melancholic instrumentation, usually reserved for the moments when the protagonist is alone and contemplating his next move, not during the action itself. This music acts as a commentary track, voicing the sorrow and isolation he cannot outwardly express. It is the sound of personal failure cloaked in the guise of necessary action. The score avoids triumphant brass or driving percussion, instead favoring low strings or a single, sustained piano note, creating an atmosphere of pervasive, almost classical tragedy rather than explosive empowerment. This musical palette prevents the audience from fully embracing the catharsis, consistently reminding them that this is an irreversible descent. The performance of the actor portraying the antagonist, the embodiment of systemic rot, is often intentionally muted until the final confrontation. This character typically projects an aura of bored entitlement, viewing the protagonist's rampage as an unfortunate but easily managed disruption to his comfortable status quo. His dialogue, when he finally engages directly, is characterized by a chilling lack of self-awareness. He genuinely seems incapable of processing the depth of suffering he has caused, framing his corruption as mere pragmatism or business acumen. This makes the protagonist's final, emotionally charged attack feel almost like an abstract philosophical argument being settled with physical force, emphasizing the gulf between those who hold institutional power and those crushed beneath it. Finally, the film subtly critiques the very audience that seeks out this type of entertainment. By showing the protagonist's descent into physical ruin and moral vacancy, the film subtly suggests that the viewer's desire for swift, violent closure is itself a contributing factor to the normalization of such brutality in narratives. The satisfaction derived from the protagonist's successful, solitary mission is intentionally undercut by the lingering images of his broken state. The final shot, which might focus tightly on a single, bloodied hand dropping a weapon, avoids a grand statement, instead focusing on the immediate, burdensome reality of the action taken. It leaves the audience not with inspiration, but with the heavy, uncomfortable residue of complicity in witnessing a necessary tragedy. The final moments of the film often pivot on the concept of legacy, albeit a grim one. If the protagonist has any surviving connections, a sibling, a former mentee, their reaction to the fallout is deliberately ambiguous. They might find themselves in a position where they must choose whether to protect the vigilante's secret, thereby tacitly endorsing his methods, or to reveal the truth and attempt to reassert some semblance of legal order, even if that order is deeply flawed. This choice presents the ultimate moral test for the surrounding characters, and, by extension, for the audience. Is a perceived victory, achieved through extra-legal means, worth the permanent moral compromise it necessitates? The film leaves this unresolved, suggesting that the shadow cast by such vigilante action extends far beyond the immediate perpetrator. The tactile nature of the violence continues to be a strong element, even in the supposed calm after the storm. If the protagonist is wounded and hiding, the sounds associated with his care, the tearing of cloth to make bandages, the dull thud of ice packs against bruised flesh, the shallow, rasping intake of breath, become the dominant auditory landscape. These sounds are deliberately unglamorous, highlighting that recovery is not a montage sequence, but a slow, agonizing process of repair in the dark. The actor conveys this through physical stillness, punctuated by involuntary twitches, suggesting a nervous system overloaded and unable to find equilibrium. He is physically present, but psychologically adrift, a ghost haunting his own existence. In examining the source of the conflict again, the film occasionally returns to the specific legal or bureaucratic failing that initiated the journey. Perhaps an official memo confirming a dismissal, a court order upholding an unjust ruling, or a photograph of the offending party smiling smugly after avoiding a prosecution are briefly illuminated. These cold, textual artifacts contrast violently with the passionate, messy bloodshed that followed. This juxtaposition serves as the film's final, bitter thesis. The written law, in its adherence to procedure, proved to be the most dangerous weapon of all, as it actively shielded the guilty while forcing the wronged into an untenable position outside of it. The influence of the lead actor's nuanced approach, his capacity for quiet suffering, is what ultimately saves the film from becoming a mere spectacle. His commitment to portraying exhaustion rather than adrenaline allows the audience to maintain a tenuous thread of empathy, even as his actions become morally unforgivable. The film understands that true tragedy lies not in the villain's defeat, but in the savior's transformation into something fundamentally broken. His ultimate success is framed not as a triumph of justice, but as the successful completion of a necessary, albeit self-destructive, task. The final lingering shot, stripped of music and dialogue, becomes a portrait of necessary ruin, leaving the viewer with the unsettling feeling that the only thing definitively avenged was the protagonist's own peace of mind. The very structure of the narrative suggests an awareness of its own cyclical nature, echoing classic Greek tragedies, where fate, once set in motion, cannot be averted, only endured. The protagonist's transformation is less a character evolution and more a predetermined collapse into a role mandated by the failure of his environment. This sense of inescapable destiny is often subtly underscored by the framing devices used when showing the outside world. For instance, scenes where the protagonist observes ordinary life continuing, a family walking in a park, traffic flowing smoothly, are shot through obscured glass or rain-streaked windows, visually reinforcing his status as an outsider who can observe normalcy but never rejoin it. He is perpetually separated by the consequences of his choices, locked out of the very world he fought to protect. The film also cleverly employs misdirection regarding the expected scale of the protagonist's network. In many revenge narratives, the lone wolf acquires a secret, highly efficient support system of hackers, ex-military contacts, or underworld benefactors. Here, the assistance, when it appears, is reluctant, amateurish, and fleeting. The tech support might be a scared teenager who quickly retracts his help after the first close call, or the insider might be motivated purely by self-preservation, abandoning the protagonist mid-scheme. This deliberate lack of a safety net amplifies the protagonist's isolation and underscores that his final confrontation is truly a one-man operation, executed on borrowed time and dwindling resources. This narrative constraint forces the audience to focus solely on his individual capacity for endurance rather than external plot machinery. The actor's physical performance is particularly noteworthy in conveying the protagonist's internal moral negotiation, especially when dealing with collateral damage. There are moments where he has the opportunity to strike a key target, but hesitates because an innocent is momentarily positioned between them. These micropauses, which might last only a fraction of a second on screen, are imbued with immense significance. They are the last vestiges of the old morality, fighting against the hardened pragmatism of the Avenger. The subsequent action, whether he chooses to wait or take a riskier shot, defines his final moral position. If he waits, it's a testament to the man he was. If he acts despite the collateral risk, it signals his full immersion into the amorality of the mission. Ultimately, the film functions as a meditation on the very definition of victory. The protagonist achieves his singular goal, the physical dismantling of the primary sources of his pain. Yet the visual evidence suggests that he has achieved only a cessation of suffering, not a restoration of justice or peace. The final tableau, often involving him alone in an anonymous utilitarian space, a cheap motel room, a deserted public stairwell, speaks volumes. He is stripped of all context, all social anchors. The dubbing, while occasionally distracting, paradoxically supports this final emptiness. The silence following the last spoken word is deafening because there is no one left to understand or validate his journey. The film posits that when the system fails to deliver justice, the individual who steps in to enforce it must necessarily destroy the very framework of meaning that previously defined them. The lingering thematic thread woven throughout the film is the sheer exhausting weight of maintenance required to sustain a lie. In this case, the lie that personal vengeance can substitute for societal accountability. The protagonist, having dismantled the visible structure of his immediate oppressors, is immediately faced with the Sisyphean task of guarding the silence surrounding his actions. He cannot simply walk away. His survival now depends on actively managing the narrative gaps he has created. This shifts the tone from active revenge to paranoid self-preservation, a far less glamorous endeavor that requires constant vigilance against both former allies who might talk and remaining elements of the corrupt network looking for retaliation. This shift is visually reflected in the protagonist's surroundings. The anonymous hiding spots become less about temporary safety and more about constant surveillance. He is always looking out of windows, checking mirrors, and sleeping lightly. The actor, whose earlier physicality suggested controlled power, now embodies a tightly wound anxiety, his movements jerky and economical, conserving energy because he knows there are no more reserves to draw upon. The muted color palette deepens here, suggesting that even in daylight, the protagonist exists under a permanent shroud of suspicion. The few remaining secondary characters who witness the aftermath, perhaps the sympathetic detective or the reluctant neighbor, are themselves subtly marked by their proximity to his chaos. They do not receive medals or congratulations. Rather, they are treated with suspicion by the larger police apparatus, becoming temporary collateral damage victims themselves. Their fear of association with the vigilante mirrors the audience's own apprehension about the ripple effects of extra-legal action. This societal recoil isolates the protagonist further, confirming that his path, while momentarily successful in achieving personal closure, has rendered him toxic to any